everyone and welcome. This is Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to build our first Angular 2 application from scratch. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is define our root component. Let's define a class named app. This will be the entry point of our application. We need to annotate it with the @component annotation. And inside the @component annotation, we need to pass in a JavaScript object that contains two mandatory properties. One is a selector, so this is a CSS selector that will define to which HTML elements in the page this component gets applied to. We're going to give an example of such a component in a second. The second mandatory property is the template property. We need to specify either a template or a template URL. We will see that in a future lesson. Right now, let's define an inline template, which simply prints a message to the screen saying hello world. How can we use this component that we just created? What does this look like in terms of HTML? If we see here the HTML of this page, we are going to add to this page a custom HTML element named app, which Angular will associate via the app selector to our component. And so it will replace the content of this custom app tag by the message hello world. And this is one of the most powerful features of Angular 2. We can create our own custom HTML elements. What we need to do now is to start our Angular 2 application. We need to bootstrap it, to use the framework's terminology. So to do that, we have several ways of doing it. The recommended way of doing it in development mode is to use the Platform Browser Dynamic Bootstrap module method. So what this takes is an Angular 2 module definition, which will be used to bootstrap the application. So what is an Angular 2 module? We are going to go into modules in detail later in this course. Right now, for us, it's enough to know that a module is a way of grouping related Angular 2 functionality, grouping related components, directives, pipes, and services in a single logical unit. Our application has one root module. Let's write it. So we just need to define a class that by convention should be called app module, and we are going to apply it the @ng-module annotation. Inside it, we are going to pass it a configuration object. In this configuration object, we need to define which components this module recognizes. And we are going to add in, of course, our app component, the root component of our application. We also should specify which is the entry point of the application, because we could have many components that are recognized by this module, but we haven't told Angular what is the entry point of our application. In this case, we are going to configure it via the bootstrap property, and we are going to say that our root component is the app component. So we pass in this module to our bootstrap call, and we should have a running application, right? Let's give it a try. If we now try this out, we can see that we have here an error in the console. Why is that? That's because we have not imported the browser module that contains all the core Angular 2 directives and much more. If you are developing a web application that is going to run in a browser, we should import the browser module. If we are running in other environments, such as, for example, native mobile, we would have another module that would replace the browser module. For the moment, let's include it and see what happens. If we now try this out, we can see that our first Angular 2 application is up and running. Summarize. Each Angular 2 application is a tree of components, and there is usually only one root component. We need to specify a root bootstrap module that we need to pass to our bootstrap function. This module will declare which components this application recognizes, what are the components that make up this application. What we do here is we can import them one by one in the declarations property, or we can import them together with directives and pipes and services as groups of related functionality named modules, and we can import modules in the imports property of the module declaration. If we are building a web application, we need to import browser module in our root component only. We should not import it elsewhere in the application. We need to tell the application what is its entry point. There could be several. Actually, notice that the bootstrap property is an array, but in most cases there is only one entry point for the application, the root component. What we're going to do now is we're going to write our first non-root component. We're going to add a visual component to our application. It's coming right up in the next lesson. Hello everyone, how's it going? It's Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to write our first Angular 2 component. Let's build a very simple widget, a search box widget, which contains an input box, and next to it we have a button to clear the input box. So let's get started. What we really want to do is we want to define an extra HTML element to the standard HTML elements that a page might have. We want to create a search-box HTML element, and we want to be able to use it in our application just like it was a normal HTML element. So how can we do this? We define an Angular 2 component. We define a class, let's name it simply searchbox. We are going to annotate it with the @component annotation. Again, this tells Angular that this is a component. Inside the configuration object, we are going to define a selector. The selector needs to match the HTML element name that we are going to use, in this case search-box. So by convention, the CSS selector that we apply here in a component should be an element selector. We should not, for example, use property selectors here. What we need to do also is to define a template for the component. What will the component look like visually on screen? A component might use other components. In this case, we are just going to add an input box to the component, and next to it we are going to add simply a clear button. And there we have it. We have a very simple component defined. In the upcoming lessons we are going to see how to add behavior to this component. But right now we just want this HTML to be displayed on the screen in place of the search-box component HTML tag. To do that, what we can do is we can try to run the application like this. What will happen is that nothing will be displayed. This is because the application is not aware of the search-box component. Nowhere in our application we have configured this component. We need to do so by adding it to the module definition of our application. In this case, because we only have one component for the moment, we are simply going to add it directly in the declarations property of our root module. If we try to use this component again, if we reload the page, we can see that our component is now working. In the next few lessons, we are going to add behavior to this component. Namely, we are going to pass it inputs and we are going to receive outputs out of it. So stay tuned because it's coming right up. Welcome to a lesson of the Angular University. In this lesson we are going to learn about component inputs. If you already know component inputs, in the end of this lesson I'm going to share a way of abbreviating certain situations where we are passing input to a component, so you might not be aware of that. So let's start with a simple example straight away. This is a search box component. It has an input box and a clear button. Now let's say that we want our placeholder text. We would like this not to be constant, but we would like to take it from a variable that is part of our search box component class. Let's do that. Let's define a variable. Let's call it text, and we are going to assign it the text that we want. Now, how do we output this to the component template? we're going to use the interpolation syntax that we are going to cover in more detail in a future lesson. Right now we are just going to output the value of a string into the template. This double curly brace expression is an interpolation expression, so the double curly brace is recognized by Angular and tells it that the content inside the double curly brace is an expression that Angular should evaluate by taking as context the component itself. So if we, inside double curly braces, we output text, that will be taken from the search box component. Let's try this out. If we now reload the page, we can see that the placeholder is type your search as expected. Now, we would like to take this one step further. We would like to make the placeholder text configurable by any other component that is using the search box component. For that, we need to make the variable text an input of the component, and we can do so by annotating it with the @input annotation. And notice the parentheses at the end of the annotation. Without this, the annotation will not work. Now, one thing, we don't want the input that is passed to the component to be named text. That's just an internal name for an internal variable. We want the input to be named placeholder, like the standard HTML attribute. So now, how do we use this input? How do we pass in an input to a component? So we go to the component that is using search box, in this case our root component, and we are going to pass it in a placeholder input variable. We do so with the angle brackets template syntax notation. This is the template syntax notation for inputs in Angular 2 components. We are going to pass into the input variable placeholder, we're going to pass it in a string. The goal is that this string overrides the default value of the text property inside the search box component. So let's try this out to see if this works. As we can see, we have custom placeholder displayed correctly as expected. So the input property is working. Now, you might think that this is a very common use case to pass a constant string as an input. Yes, it's true that in certain situations this might be a dynamic property, but in this case, let's say that it will always be constant. In that case, this syntax that we have here is slightly verbose. For this particular case, where we are passing in a constant string to an input property, we have an abbreviated notation syntax that we mentioned in the beginning of the lesson. If we remove the quotes around the strings and if we remove the square brackets, this will still work. So let's give it a try. As we can see, everything is still working and this looks like just a plain HTML attribute. This is much more readable. It actually looks like a plain HTML attribute, which is also more intuitive for someone looking at the template. What we're going to do now is we are going to add behavior to this component. We are going to, when the user clicks the clear button, we are going to clear the input box. So we are going to learn the template syntax for events in the next lesson, which is coming right up. Hello everyone and welcome. This is Vasco. Welcome to the Angular University. In this lesson, we are going to learn about component events and event emitters. So let's get started. What we're going to do here is we're going to take this simple component, which is the search box component, which has an input and a clear button. We're going to implement the clear button behavior. So what we want to do is whenever we type on the input search box, when we click clear, the clear button, the input box should be cleared. So how do we handle this? Let's use the events template syntax for this. So what we want to do here is in the element where the click occurs, so the button, we're going to add a click handler and we are going to use the rounded parentheses or normal parentheses for this. This is the template syntax for events in Angular 2, both browser events and custom events, as we will see in a moment. Now, inside the rounded braces, we're going to type the, in this case, browser event to which we want to respond to, in this case, the click event. On the right hand side, we are going to define how this event should be handled. In this case, we want to call the clear component method. Let's implement this method by simply adding a call to log to the console. Let's try this out. If we now type in something and we click the clear button, we can see that our statement is logged to the console as expected. Now let's talk about how could we implement the clear behavior. Well, one way to do it, let's do it first in plain JavaScript. So let's select using the Chrome DevTools. We're going to right click on the input box and we're going to inspect it in the HTML panel. If we now switch back to the console, the $0 variable contains the last element that was clicked while inspecting this on the DevTools. So in this case, $0 is the DOM element of the input box. How can we clear this? We can clear it by assigning it a value of an empty string, for example. So if we do $0.value equals empty string, this is an example of how to clear the input box. So let's implement this in Angular 2. Let's now implement the clear behavior. So what we want to do here is we want to introduce a new concept besides events. We want to introduce the concept of references. So we can assign a template reference using the hash character, and we are going to give it a name to the input box. We are going to call it hash input. So whenever inside the template we refer to input, we are referring to the DOM element of the input text box. So now we can pass it in as a parameter inside the clear method, for example. Now, what we can do inside the clear method is we simply assign it a value of an empty string, and this will clear the input box. Let's try this out. If we now type in the input box and we hit the clear button, we can see that the input box is being cleared as expected. Now we have seen how to use the template syntax for events. In an upcoming lesson, we're going to see how the same syntax can be applied to custom events. We will first learn how to externalize the templates of our components and how to apply CSS styles to our components. Then we are going to tie everything together in a more complex introduction to components example, where we are going to have multiple components interacting with each other and using custom events using event emitter. So stay tuned, all of this is coming right up in the next lesson. Hello everyone and welcome, this is Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn how to externalize component templates in an external file. We are going to learn the best practices recommended by the official style guide for that. So let's get started. We have here a very simple component with an inline template defined using the template property in the component annotation. Defining templates inline, it's usually okay when we are trying out something, or maybe if your component is a very small component. But in general, we really want to separate the template into an external HTML file. So let's do that. Let's extract the HTML template from the component and let's create an external file which has the same name as the component file itself, except it has a different HTML extension. We just copy paste inside this file the template itself, and now we just need to apply it to the component. To do so, we go back to the component file, and instead of using template, the inline template, we are going to use the template URL property. As we put the template in the same folder as the component itself, we just have to type in here the file name of the template. This will work just like this, transparently, if you are using, for example, the latest Angular CLI. If that's not the case, then you really have to give Angular some more information on how to find the template file. If you are using a CommonJS compatible module loader like, for example, System.js, you will have available at runtime a variable named module. You can take it and use module.id, pass it to the component via the module ID property, and Angular will know how to find the template. to avoid TypeScript errors, you need to declare the module variable. Again, if you are using the CLI, you don't need this module.id variable. So it's one of the many advantages of using the CLI. So this covers how to handle HTML templates in our components. Let's now see how can we add styles to a component and what is the big advantage of doing it the Angular 2 way. Stay tuned, it's coming right up. Welcome, this is Vasco from the Angular University, and in this lesson we are going to learn how to style Angular 2 components. We are going to learn what is the big advantage of styling components the Angular 2 way. We could always style a component by adding simply a link tag to our HTML page. That would work perfectly with Angular 2 without any problem. But Angular 2 introduces a new improved way of doing CSS. Let's have a look at it. The way that this works is in each component we can define styles that are specific to the component. So we have a styles property that takes on an array. This is an array of strings. Each string is just an extract of CSS. So let's just add some CSS to this component. If we add here some CSS as part of this styles array, and we refresh the page, we can see that the CSS got applied to the component. But let's have a closer look to see how this was done. The styles were actually added as a style tag in the head of the page. We can see here that the styles are applied to the component, but notice this property with a randomly generated name that gets associated to the component. All the styles reference this attribute here. This means that these styles have a very high degree of specificity because they all have an attribute in it. This causes these styles to take precedence over almost any style that you might want to apply in a page. Compared to the specificity of most commonly used libraries like styles in Bootstrap, etc., these styles would take precedence. So this mechanism is a way of partial style isolation. We can define styles that in the vast majority of cases will take precedence over any other style on the page. But the component is not really fully isolated from a style point of view. It's still inheriting, for example, fonts from the main page. If you are building an Angular 2 component, it's better to use the styles property to define the CSS of the component. This means that, for one, the styles of the component are guaranteed to not interfere with the styles in the remaining of the page, because they are based on this randomly generated property. Also, it's much less likely that styles on the page will override this style, meaning that the component will be reusable in a larger number of situations. We can also define CSS styles in external files in a very similar way to how we did it with templates. We simply create an external file which has the same name as the component file but a different extension, in this case CSS. What we're going to do is we are going to copy the CSS inside the file and we are going to add this file associating it to the component via the styles URLs property. Notice that this is an array, so you can pass in several CSS files, basic notions of how to set up a component. We can define its template, we can define its styles, and we can define the component class. What we're going to do now is we are going to tie all these concepts together with the notion of inputs and outputs of components. We're going to build a more complex example where several components interact with each other. It's coming right up in the next lesson.